This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This week, this video continues in our series, Who is Jesus Christ for Us Today? The Theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we're going to be looking particularly at this question of what it means to be in Christ. As just a quick reminder of our previous two videos, which if you don't remember, go check those out. The first as an introduction and the second one on the church. As Bonhoeffer, when he asked this question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? He says that Christ must be at the center, or Christ is all in all. And what he means by the center or all in all is that a faithful understanding of who Jesus is in our lives is in the center of our lives. And he was anxious that too many Christians in his context, and I would say in ours too, really looked for religiosity where human knowledge and understanding failed. So say at death, or say when there is tragedy that we can't understand. Then they turn to religion, but for the bulk of their lives, they would act the same way whether they were religious or not. And so instead, if Christ is all in all, then therefore Christ needs to be present for the whole of who humans are, their whole life, not just pieces. And we talked last time about kind of a process he had that was from isolation to community. It wasn't framed, or it was framed that way, but it wasn't called isolation. It was called being convicted alone as a sinner before God, then receiving the grace of participating in the, if you remember, one Christ, and being justified in that one Christ, and then by being in that one Christ, there is community of love reestablished as a new creation. That's what we looked at last time. Today is going to be really asking the how question. This was a process, kind of logical process, 1, 2, 3. Whereas today, what is this theologically? How is this happening? We understand Jesus dies on the cross. What does that do for me? Jesus is raised. What does that do for me? What does that look like? Well, Bonhoeffer is a reader of Paul. Paul, and the Gospels too, but especially Paul, uses this phrase, participating in Christ. I would suggest that for the bulk of you viewers, you have probably heard being one body in Christ so frequently that you may not have noticed how strange that is. We don't talk about being in a person. We don't talk about being in a entity. We can talk about being in a community a little bit, but it's strange. It's a strange phrase. Well, and it was strange. Well, this was a world in which they understood participation. And by participation, this was a most commonly associated with Greek philosophy, but participation was saying, how am I part of something else? It wasn't just participating in two people kind of doing stuff together, but instead, who I am is governed by something bigger than me. And we could have a talk about Platonic understandings of the forms, but that's probably enough. Who I am is governed by something bigger than me, that we relate with something larger than ourselves. They did not have the autonomous self like we had. Self was always in relationship to another. And Paul frames it as, well, in your baptism, you have moved from your participation in Adam to now in Christ. And what Paul means by that, and what Bonhoeffer would be agreeing with, is that these are two ways of being human. As in Adam, all die, so in Christ, all are made alive. Well, how? How does that happen? Well, to be participating in is to suggest whatever Christ has done, if I'm participating in Christ, I also am there. Whatever Adam has done, if I'm participating in Adam, I also am there. So if Adam is dying, I also am dying. If Christ is being raised, I also am being raised. Some of you might know, for example, Paul's language in 1 Thessalonians 4, when he talks about, what about those who died? Did they miss the return of Jesus? He says, no, you do not need to grieve as others do who have no hope, because just as Christ, we know, was raised from the dead, so those in Christ will also raise from the dead. Well, how can he say that? Because whatever Christ has done, you have done. That's what participation is. It is changing your life in a new way of being human and a new orientation to this structure. That's what he's going to start with. So if that's true, then what does this do for our understanding of who is Jesus Christ for us today? This sounds a little ethereal, perhaps. Well, Bonhoeffer wants to say, and this comes from his book, Discipleship. How do I understand myself? How do I understand who I am? And really, we could have called this what also the time we're going to talk about the self. It says, well, to understand it rightly, we should understand the structure of who Christ is as a medium or mediator. He makes a distinction between what is medium and what is immediate. Bonhoeffer makes the claim that Christ is our mediator. Christ is the medium between, I should use a different color so it doesn't get confusing here, between God, then there's Christ, and then there's me. This isn't too surprising. Most people are probably familiar with Christ as a mediator like this. And yes, Christ is God, but go with it for now. But Bonhoeffer says that's half the picture. It's not all the picture. Because, in addition, you say, do you have an immediate relationship with God? Well, you have an immediate relationship with Christ, Christ the mediator to God. But he says, but that's not all. That is, Christ is also the mediator between me and all others. So that, what is the immediate relationship I have? Christ, and only Christ. Everything else is mediated through Christ. And so he'd say that's what it means to be in Christ. That now everything that I am is mediated through Christ into the world. So what's my self? Well, the self is one that has only one immediate relationship. Everything else is through this. Now, this isn't to say that therefore, he says, you don't relate with the world. No, no, no. He says, now you see the world rightly. Because if Christ has brought in new life, this is what we discover in Christ. How do you see the life that is in the world except through Christ? That new life as a new creation must be only through Christ. But he'll go farther. That, he says, that is, before we go to how he's going to go farther, not only will he see the world rightly, but now we act and work in the world, but understand there is something different between how this externally looks versus how we are understanding what is actually happening, what's the reality. Externally, this looks the same. Whether I've mediated the world around me through Christ or not, it looks the same. But the reality is, that's the only way I can see what the world even is. And he goes to this, and then here, there's what I was saying about, and there's more. Let's use a different color yet. Is what about the self? See, Bonhoeffer goes so far as to say it's not just that through Christ you see the other world rightly. This is the only way you can even see yourself rightly. Because he says, and this is good Lutheran theology, that the human on its own is turned in on itself. It tries to reach God, it cannot, and so then it turns in on itself and has a poor reflection of who they really are, but only as a convicted person. Remember this isolation. I've been convicted of my own culpability. I can get that, but I'm just looking at myself rather solipsistically. I don't see who I am with the whole world around me. I really can only see myself in Christ. Because now Christ is the mediator, not just for how we view the world around us, but even how I am able to view anything at all, including myself. Because for Bonhoeffer, the self was not an autonomous individual. The self was here is where I relate with Christ. And he questions, what about the indifference of people to Christ? He questions that. The New Testament certainly doesn't have space for indifference, because he says, how can I see who I am except through Christ? And if I can't, then all I see is myself going round and round, failing to see what is really happening. So he is global in this perspective. And then he says, well, so where does that leave people? Well, there is a void. In the void of people is where faith resides. And we'll explain why in a second. Because it has to do with this question of indifference. Indifference, in the New Testament, Jesus calls all people, and they are for or against. It's an either-or situation. The completely righteous Messiah calling for disciples. That's very clear. Yet, who actually shows up in the New Testament? Not the ardent religious folks, not the religious elites who might be able to follow such a hard call. Instead, it's for the marginalized. The irony, or he says the almost paradox, that this either-or prophet, you follow me or don't follow me, turns out to be welcomed to sinners, to tax collectors, to those on the outskirts who never claimed they could ever follow someone. Why? Well, he says, what do all those people have in common? They make no claim for their own self. Instead, they see there's a void. There's emptiness. And by the way, if you read Bonhoeffer's book, Creation and Fall, he wants to make very clear, void is simply that. It is empty. Void doesn't do anything. Void is just open. And if it's open, then that's where God acts, which is why in the void of the human is where faith resides. Because there, now you can see yourself in Christ. The thing that blocked you from seeing yourself in Christ is if you continue to be curved in on yourself. Instead, you see, within me is where God is indeed acting. Here, God sees the worth of those who are societally seen as worthless. And also, by the way, God can name as worthless what society can be viewed as of much value. So we see Bonhoeffer is saying, how do I know who I am? Where does it mean to be in Christ? It is a new way of being human, a new creation that I experience right now in how I relate to not just other people, but even unto myself. This is who I am every moment of the day. Christ is all in all. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.